This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
I had to this way. Welcome to today's meeting of the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. On our agenda today is a discussion on how the London Fire Brigade is adapting to climate change and meeting the Mayor's target for net zero by 2030. Before we begin, we have a few small items of business. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Members of the public may like to follow @London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag #AssemblyFire for this meeting. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received today from Assemblymember Bailey, for whom Assemblymember Boff will be substituting, from Assemblymember Duval, for whom Assemblymember Moema will be substituting, and also from Assemblymember Rogers.
Thank you. And can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? Take silence as no. And can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent and received? We now move on to our main item, a discussion on how the London Fire Brigade is adapting to climate change and meeting the Mayor's target for net zero by 2030. Can I welcome our guests? We have Mostaque Ahmed, Director for Corporate Services, London Fire Brigade. Paul McCourt, Assistant Commissioner, Operational Policy and Assurance, London Fire Brigade. Jonathan Smith, Deputy Commissioner, London Fire Brigade. Simon Moore, Head of Planning for Thames Water, and Alex Nickson, Head of Partnership and Catchment Management at Thames Water. Before the discussion begins, can I please remind guests and members to position your microphones so that you can be heard clearly in the chamber and on the webcast. Moving it closer to you by picking it up from the base, so here, not here, may make it easier. And please do not adjust by moving the neck. I'll start with the first question, which is to you, Jonathan. Climate change scientists indicate that the UK summers will continue to get drier and hotter, and we can see that this week in Europe. It's positively scorching. Are you confident that the LFB can continue to deliver an effective fire service response for Londoners in this context?
Good morning, everyone. Well, I think, the premise of your question in terms of where we find ourselves now when we look at what colleagues are facing in Southern Europe in particular, just highlights actually that this is in many ways the challenge of our time, that we're going to have to manage this over the medium and longer term. In terms of our assessment of risk as London Fire Brigade, the challenge that's posed by climate change, both in terms of extreme heat and in terms of wide area flooding, which is, again, a subject area we're going to come on to in this committee meeting, is absolutely part of our central planning and strategic planning. So it sits firmly within the community risk management plan, that actually climate change and the impacts of climate change for us as one of London's blue light services is something that we have to plan for, both now in the medium and the longer term. In terms of our sort of planning and preparation and the confidence that we've got to be able to deal with these issues as they arise, I mean, one of the things that's come out from the major incident review that was done following what we faced, almost a year to the day last year, was around that we need to continually learn and adapt, that actually the way that the risk is continuing to develop means that we actually need to be much more agile as an organisation, that we are responsive to the challenges that are faced, because actually this is continuing to evolve. I was listening to the news last night, and there was a village in China that reached 52 degrees yesterday, which is, that type of heat is just unprecedented. If we look at Rome today, I think the temperatures are somewhere in the region of 42, 43 degrees. Now, we can reasonably expect to see those types of temperatures coming to the UK, and we need to be able to prepare for that and learn from what we found last year, because as we've discussed at this committee before, we had firefighters operating in 40, 41 degree heat last year on the 18th and 19th of July in particular. And that has meant we've had to look at all of our welfare arrangements, we've had to look at the training, the preparation, the PPE, how we're actually going to tackle these fires going forward, because actually the traditional approach is not the way that you can tackle these types of wildfires when they do develop. That how we expect our firefighters and officers to operate in these types of environment is continuing to develop and evolve. So I think where we've got the community risk management plan and now an annual assessment of risk, which is really important, the brigade is now much more flexible and agile to be able to respond to these challenges as they come forward. You know, we've rolled out significant training packages that are built on the experience of other colleagues within the National Fire Chiefs Council and just as crucially internationally. You know, level 1 wildfire training has now been rolled out to every fire station and firefighter in the brigade. We've got now 40 tactical wildfire advisors that will be deployed when we respond to these incidents to support the incident command decisions of the incident commander, which means we will fight these fires in a different way. We're trialling a wildfire PPE specifically at a couple of stations this year to see actually whether there's something in a longer term procurement that we'll look to move to. We've got hydration sachets on our pumping appliances. We've now got head protection that have been given to every single firefighter in the brigade. We're improving our welfare provision because we know when we deal with these fires they can be long and protracted, and that was feedback that we received as a result of the experience from last year. And I think that's probably where I end the answer to this question, is that we looked at what happened last year on the 18th and 19th of July in particular. We commissioned a major incident review that looked at the response in its entirety, looked at how prepared we were, looked at what protection measures we could have put in place, then looked at the operational response itself. And there's a series of recommendations that have come from that review, and we've made good progress against those recommendations. We are much better placed to deal with whatever we may face in the next few weeks this summer, but it's something we're going to have to keep coming back to because the threat and risk continues to develop and evolve, which is why the annual assessment of risk, local borough risk management plans, which have a partnership working with local authorities, partner agencies such as Thames Water and others, is going to be crucial, because trying to deal with this is very much a team sport. There's no one agency that has got all of the gifts within their offer to be able to tackle the challenges that climate change presents. So it's going to have to be a team effort, and we're going to be at the forefront of that, and that's very much part of our strategic planning in the medium and longer term.
Thanks for that. And speaking of teamwork, I'm just wondering, have any elements of the government's climate change risk assessment and national adaptation plan influenced your planning and preparedness?
Yes, it does. So obviously the government prepares national risk assessments on an annual basis across a whole range of subject areas, of which climate change is one. I was pleased to see the report that came out yesterday from the government in terms of actually the tempo that we're going to need to see over the medium and longer term in terms of preparedness for dealing with the impacts of climate change, particularly around flood defences and what that will look like. There was particular reference in the report yesterday around the health challenges that the climate change also provides, and all of the public bodies that are responsible for protecting people both in London and nationally are going to have to make sure that we're taking very seriously what's coming through from the National Risk Assessment, then how that influences the London Risk Assessment through the London Resilience Forum, of which we're all partners within that, because that is going to influence how we posture ourselves as an organisation going forward to meet the challenge that we know we are going to face over many years to come, sadly.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about London, I mean, our last meeting was talking about future challenges and current challenges around things like lithium-ion batteries, so we're factoring this all in at the same time. But also London, as you know, is changing. We're getting taller, we're getting denser. How is London sort of changing our projections and population increases and density of where people live and how we live? How is that factoring into your planning?
Well, it's all part of our strategic planning, that actually as London continues to develop, as the risk profile continues to develop, that London Fire Brigade has to be the forefront of all of that planning work going forward, because it has a consequence in terms of how the built environment is developing, which this committee has come back to, rightly so, time and time again. What population density does, what does that mean? How can we make sure that we're protecting the capital in the right way, given that the demographic challenges that we know we're going to continue to face over the next few years? The population is expected to get close to 10 million in the not too distant future, and we need to think about what does that mean for us as an emergency service and how we plan and prepare for that. That's why the community risk management plan, with the annual assessment of risk, that we have to keep coming back to, because I think the difference now between probably where we were sort of 30 or 40 years ago is the nature of risk is continuing to develop and evolve. And as a result of that, we have to be much more agile and flexible in terms of how we respond, because being too fixed in our ways of working is not going to match the risk profile as it's going to continue to develop over the next few years. If we think about the relationship of the urban-rural interface that we saw, firsthand last year, I think if we were honest, we hadn't quite realised as an organisation quite the impact that would have when you have 41 degree heat as we saw last year. So that means over the course of the last 12 months since that learning from what we faced with the major incident last year, we have had to adapt how we operate. We've had to think laterally in terms of how London Fire Brigade responds, and I think you're going to have to see that agility continue at pace over the medium and longer term.
Thank you for that. Assemblymember Boff.
Thank you. I was just wondering whether or not you'd looked at the way other countries have dealt with the challenges of fighting an increasing number of fires. Whether or not you'd looked at some technological assistance that might be provided to the LFB.
Yeah, so the short answer to that is yes. So in Paul's team within operational assurance, there's now a small research and development function. So we've been out to countries, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but we've been out to countries in Southern Europe in particular to learn from their experience, the technology, how they actually fight these fires, because it's not just in the technology that's available, it's around the preparedness and the prevention that also comes into play. They're very well practiced in managing their open areas to make sure there's signage up, that actually people's behaviour and the way you conduct yourself when you're dealing in particularly hot conditions, in countries like Greece and France and Spain and Australia, actually this is just in the public consciousness. There's a huge effort around prevention to stop these fires from occurring in the first place, so that's absolutely something that we're taking on board. And just in terms of firefighting techniques, you will often find in places like Australia and Spain, they will allow a controlled burn in an area and then focus their protection on areas that we can save rather than trying to fight everything at the same time, which is counterintuitive to us as an organisation. We want to deal with everything as we see it in front, but there are times where you have to understand the operational picture that you've got in front of you, and this is where those tactical wildfire advisors are going to be critical, because we can look at actually what is savable, what isn't savable, and then make tactical decisions based on that information.
So are you considering possibly the use of drones in the LFB? Is that something that you're looking into at the moment?
Absolutely. So we have a drone team, and I think that will continue to evolve and expand. That's one of the things that we're looking at within our new response strategy, is that the drone capability in terms of the situational awareness that it gives our operational commanders is unmatched. We've also got technology now in the control room, something called 999i, which means we can live stream mobile phone footage straight into the control room, and then we can also get those images onto our command units. All of this technology is giving us a fighting chance to deal with these incidents when they occur.
And finally, just on this, Chair, sorry to come. I was going to come in on number 4, and I realise this is more appropriate, so you can scratch me out for that question. What about wider robotics as well? I'm familiar that in the States they actually use robotic vehicles to enter areas where there's large areas of flame. So, imagine Epping Forest or Hampstead Heath is up in flames. It's going to be a dangerous environment to go into. Are you looking at wider robotics to assist firefighters there?
Yeah, so it's one of the areas of growth that we're looking to develop, so particularly in Paul's part of the organisation around the development of that research and development capability to actually make sure that we are looking at technology as it's developing and evolving internationally. Interestingly, with the fire department in New York, they've actually got robotic dogs, believe it or not, that they use, that they're able to send into particularly difficult scenarios with firefighting media. Now, that is absolutely something that we will be considering in terms of what that can do for us. And that has use within an urban environment as well as a rural environment. But the main use of things like drone technology is the situational awareness that it gives our operational commanders, so we can then make tactical decisions about where we're going to concentrate our resources to fight those fires. But
you're not discounting that those robotics can be more than just intelligence and can actually assist in fighting fires.
No, I think if you look at the development of the technology in places like China as well, that have been at the forefront in developing what firefighting robotics can actually do. The impact of things like AI as well is something that we're going to have to consider, and how we can bring that into our armoury in terms of dealing with these issues as they develop is very much the reason why we're focusing on our research and development function, because I think unless we really do look internationally and nationally, actually, we're going to be behind the times, and we need to be at the forefront of this because this is a significant risk for us to deal with.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. Deputy Commissioner, I want to ask you essentially about transparency and the major incident review. So in November last year, I asked the Mayor, will there be a major incident review and will it be published? In January, it says on the review, that was when the report date was published. In February, the Mayor answered me and said it will be published. It then took a BBC report where an FOI was issued for the report to be published. What's going on with that?
So in terms of why the report wasn't published, I'd need to come back to you and check that. There's never been, there was never anything in the report that we wouldn't want to share, because there's just learning for everyone within the report. So I can only apologise that didn't come forward as quickly as it should have done, because actually we're very keen to make sure that reports of this nature are publicised as quickly as they can, because there's just so much learning that's in there, not just for us as an organisation, but more widely than that. And as it says in the report, on many occasions we're very keen that we are seen as a learning organisation, that actually, the experience that we had over the last year is influencing what we're doing going forward, and we need to be clear and transparent about that. So quite the reason behind the delay in terms of the publication, I would need to come back and let you know via a written response if that's okay with the Chair. But as far as we're concerned, and just to give assurance to this committee, we want to be as transparent and upfront in terms of where we can identify our own areas of learning as an organisation, and then just make sure that that's publicised as quickly as it can be, so that this committee can quite rightly hold senior officers like myself to account on our performance.
I really appreciate your candidness there, and not publishing it seemed at odds with the transparency you often do come with this committee with, so that makes sense. On that same note, though, would you consider publishing more regularly? So publishing reports about climate risks and London's preparedness on a more regular basis? Yeah,
I think that is something we can do. I think, as I was mentioning before, we've now got our annual assessment of risk, which is influencing our entire preparedness as an organisation, both in terms of our operational response, our prevention and protection activity. And I think this committee and actually the wider public would benefit in understanding, how we are planning based on the risks that are presented in front of us. So I'd see no reason why we couldn't do that.
Thank you. And then finally, just on the report, I think one of the most striking things about the report, maybe I just think in pictures, but is the picture on the front cover. And fair play to the Fire Brigade for publishing, I hesitate to use the word mistake, but a huge risk, which is the diesel tank, which is so close to where the wildfires stopped. I'm presuming that diesel tank has now been moved, but I guess my question is, what proactivity is being taken place around the city for potential risks like this that might not have been so obvious just a few years ago, but now seem really worrying?
It's a really good point. So we've written to every local council on the 19th of June, outlining the particular threats and challenges that we see around climate change, to make, because as I was saying in my previous answer, there's no one agency that holds all the answers to these challenges that we face. We've got to work with partners at a local borough level. So the borough risk management plans, the toolkits that have been given to borough commanders to work directly with local partners, so that where we've got areas where we know, particularly where we've got the rural-urban interface, that actually we're taking preventative measures. We're managing the land in a better way. We're thinking about fire breaks. We've got notices up. We've got a significant publicity campaign around non-use of barbecues in open land, making sure that rubbish is collected in a speedy way to make sure there's no issues around fire loading in public areas. So there's lots of work going on, and it's why our localised approach is critical to this, because it's actually that local intelligence with our borough commanders, with the local authorities, with partner agencies at that local level, that's going to give us the opportunity to prevent these fires from happening in the first place, because there is actually an awful lot you can do just by managing the land properly, by encouraging people to behave properly when the weather is particularly hot, that actually stops these things from happening. And that's something we've got to really focus on. But then, of course, we've got to have the response arrangements in place to deal with the incidents, as sadly we know that will occur.
Thank you. You mentioned the National Fire Chiefs Council. In their absence today, I was wondering if you could update us on what responsibilities they're seeking to formalise with the government, particularly around fire and rescue services and responding to climate change.
So it's an ongoing debate in terms of what potential additional statutory responsibilities fire and rescue services would need going forward to deal with the climate situation that we find ourselves in. So we've discussed here before around potentially the need for a statutory responsibility around flooding. And I think there's significant reasons and rationale why that would be useful in terms of embedding the Fire and Rescue Service's position nationally as well as locally in terms of responding to the challenges that climate change faces. Because if I think to the community risk management plan and the assessment of risk that we are looking at the moment, it's all around. If I look at the biggest challenges that we're facing, it is absolutely embedded within climate change. Even the new and emerging technology that's coming online, which is a good thing, but of course, as the committee discussed at the last FREP meeting, there's also challenges around lithium-ion batteries and how we manage that situation. So I think there is a question around whether or not any additional statutory responsibilities for the fire service nationally would help. But what I've said to this committee before, and what I'm absolutely resolute about, is that doesn't stop us doing an awful lot now. We respond to these incidents now, we prepare for these incidents now. But I think because of the nature of the challenge that we're seeing with climate, I think even the most pessimistic scientists probably weren't expecting some of the sheer temperatures that we've seen over the course of the last sort of 2 to 3 weeks in particular. We need to factor that in as a sector nationally, and if that means a conversation with government around what that may look like in terms of any statutory responsibilities, I know the National Fire Chiefs Council will be doing that, and we would support that.
That's good to hear. When I contrast it or compare it to the Environment Agency, for instance, who made the strong statement, I think last year or maybe the year before, about adapt or die, that was a pretty strong statement. Do you think the NFCC would go as far as that in lobbying government in terms of being really clear about what a risk this is to Londoners or, in fact, anyone in the UK?
I think the National Fire Chiefs Council is being clear with the meetings that we're having with government ministers at the moment in terms of the challenge that's posed by climate change. I was at the NFCC's Operations Committee last week, and the vast majority of the conversation at that meeting was all around the preparedness for what we know is going to be a challenging summer. Colleagues there from Greater Manchester and West Yorkshire talking about dealing with, the fires on the moors up there and what additional capability that they're bringing in, the use of new technology, as Assembly Member Boff was referring to before, that's now being brought to bear, looking at new equipment. So this is going to be an ongoing conversation for us as a sector. Because there's no doubt the Fire and Rescue Service has a huge role, not only in terms of our response to these incidents when they occur, but also working with partners to prevent this from happening in the first place.
Thank you. And do you know of any work the NFCC are doing to build relationships with other blue light services and local authorities, particularly around climate change again?
Well, I think if I look at locally for the time being, if you look at the London Resilience Forum and you look at the London Risk Register and the risks that sit within there, and obviously that's something that Thames Water participate in as a Category 2 responder. We're very clear that the London Fire Brigade has a critical role to manage the impact of climate change, but we cannot do it on our own. This is something that we need to work very closely with partners across all of the agencies. If you look at the challenge faced by policing and the NHS last year as well, a lot of the challenge around the heat began as a health crisis before it then moved into the challenges that we faced around fire. And actually that's right, that we work very closely with our blue light partners, but also with local government and water authorities and other Category 2 agencies to make sure that there's a proper team approach to how we're going to deal with this. Because the problem is complex, it's multifaceted, and it requires a number of answers to try and deal with these issues as and when they occur.
Thank you. And finally, I think the community...
4 supplementary questions, I think.
Oh, I was going to ask a question that was tabled.
Okay, but that's it.
Okay. And finally, what work has London Fire Brigade taken to raise awareness of the impact of climate change with communities, especially those who are vulnerable? Yes,
there's a big publicity campaign that's ongoing at the moment across a whole range of issues to do with climate change. So one of the really important steps that we've taken is to our website. In terms of what's on there for flood response in particular, has got an awful lot of information that people can use in terms of advice if they're subjected to flooding and what that looks like, what precautions they can take. So there's a good video clip on there around an emergency grab bag and what you would need to have in there. They're actually recommending that people put the national flood line in their mobile phone. So sensible advice like that. As I said before, we've written to every local authority on the 19th of June, particularly around the challenge around wildfire. We've done a press release around the challenges around wildfire, and I think there's something like 15 tweets that we've put out around things like not using barbecues, making sure that people are behaving properly when the weather is hot, making sure that rubbish is discarded properly, being careful with smoking materials. So the communication strategy has to go hand in hand with our operational and preparedness strategy, because a lot of this actually is about education and making sure that we're talking to our communities and helping them understand the challenge that we face. And what that looks like on the front line is through our borough risk management plans, that the work of firefighters on the front line is about talking to our communities within the boroughs so that they can understand the challenges that this faces and what sensible steps they can take to protect themselves and their communities, because we know this is something that's going to be ongoing.
And presumably in the language of the communities as well.
Absolutely right, which is a lesson, that we've learned in terms of what community engagement looks like. It needs to be on the terms of the community and asking the right questions in the right way.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And moving along to wildfires, please, Assemblymember Moema.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to all of you. Last September, this committee discussed wildfires, and the FBU told us that 39 appliances were unavailable that day, and according to Commissioner Rowe, that was due to a lack of firefighters. So what action have you taken to ensure the maximum number of appliances are available?
Thank you. So yes, as we discussed at that FREP meeting, we have particular staffing challenges, and a number of the reasons for that is a result of a bit of a COVID legacy from when we had to take sensible precautions around stopping recruitment, stopping training. And of course, that then had a knock-on impact in terms of what the average vacancy margin looked like for the organisation. So I'm pleased to report that this year we're in a better position. We've reduced that average vacancy margin by a third. So we've been doing that in a number of ways. Predominantly around increasing the number of FFDs, so firefighter recruits coming into the organisation. We've uplifted the support to Babcock, because as we discussed the last time I was at the committee, when Babcock were here, they have got a limit in terms of the numbers of FFDs they can bring into the organisation. So we've now supplemented that with our own staff, and there's a programme to keep that going for the next year to bring more people into the organisation. We're about to launch a new transferee advert to bring in transferees from other fire and rescue services. So we were going to do that earlier in the year, but we needed to let the industrial relations picture settle down before we did that. We're now going to do that in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So we anticipate we should see significant interest in firefighters looking to transfer into London Fire Brigade from other services. We're also much better at our strategic workforce planning now. So we have a 7-day planning cycle, which means we look at the particular pressures and challenges on the organisation over a 7-day period. This is direct learning from last year. So back in June, we had a couple of days where the temperatures were getting up to 31, 32 degrees. We were able to plan for that, and we used tools like pre-arranged overtime to make sure that the bulk of our appliances were staffed to be able to deal with any particular incident that occurred on that day. Now, fortunately, the operational response wasn't required, but we were prepared in a way that we weren't last year, because we've now got much better strategic workforce planning in place. We also do that on a day-to-day basis. So every day there's a meeting chaired by who's called AC1, so the Assistant Commissioner who's in charge of our operational response on that day has the key officers in a meeting every day to look at any particular pinch points or challenges that we're facing. And if that means we need to take action like cancel training, bring people in who are going for medical appointments or fitness tests to make sure that we've got more firefighters available, then we will do that, and we have done that. We're also now moving to a model of training as a watch. So we've got firefighters who don't count in our numbers at the start of the day who are off doing things like breathing apparatus training. We can now recall those back into the organisation in a much more effective way than we have done before. So if we were to face a challenge today, we would be able to recall staff who are out on training courses at the moment into the organisation to crew as many appliances as possible. Fundamentally, we want to reduce that average vacancy margin as close to zero as we possibly can. We're working very closely with colleagues in the GLA to be able to bring forward the required resourcing in order to do that. We're working closely with Babcock's in order to do that. But as we manage our resources at the moment, we're doing that in a much more intelligent way so that we won't see the scenario that we had last year where there were particular staffing challenges that we had to overcome.
Okay, and just because I was on this committee last year, the Babcock issue, that was a long-term contract that you have with them.
That's right.
20 odd years or something like that. That was procured
25 years,
under different leadership. But do you feel like it gives people confidence if I might be misunderstanding what you're saying, but if we're saying to people that as part of that, you're having to add your own resources to that contract in order to make it work. And also, I would appreciate a bit more granularity around the point you've made about agreed overtime. Are you still reliant, like to what extent are you reliant on people doing additional hours as opposed to having additional fire crew available?
So in terms of your first question, in terms of our relationship with Babcock, so there's a 25-year contract, and obviously there are key performance indicators and there are contractual obligations that sit within that contract. So on an annual basis, Babcock will deliver 240 FFDs into the organisation, and that was the agreed contract. There is some flex in that, so at the moment we've managed to get Babcock up to 280, so that we've got an additional 40 that are coming in, but because we are really determined to bring that average vacancy margin down as quickly but as sustainably as we can, we will also supplement that with our own instructors within London Fire Brigade to bring the average vacancy margin down by bringing new people into the organisation. On top of which, we will also use tools such as transferees to come into the organisation to bring that down. So it's a contractual element that we're working with Babcock, collegiately to make sure that we're able to resolve. But of course, in Babcock's defence, this was a result of the challenges that we faced from COVID, and we just need to make sure that the contract is flexing in a way that serves London Fire Brigade. In terms of your second point around pre-arranged overtime, so it was an HMI recommendation that London Fire Brigade shouldn't be as reliant on pre-arranged overtime as it has been before, of which we are in complete agreement. That is not a stable model to manage your resources on a day-to-day basis. So we introduced something called a priority crewing guide, which basically means we can take a much more targeted approach in terms of how we crew our appliances to make sure we're still meeting our 6 and 8 attendance standards, but we've not got a complete reliance on pre-arranged overtime. There will always be a need for pre-arranged overtime. We always have to have that as a tool to be able to flex with the particular challenges that we've got. But since the 1st of April this year, we have not had to rely on pre-arranged overtime in the way that we have done before, because we've got this new priority crewing guide in place, which is actually enabling us to take risk-critical decisions in terms of how we staff our pumping appliances, but doing it in a sustainable way and, crucially, in a controlled way. So the issue that the HMI had, and indeed the GLA have quite rightly challenged us on, is that our pre-arranged overtime spend was to a degree uncontrolled. Well, now that we've got the strategic 7-day planning forecast in place, it means we can take decisions over a week period in terms of what resources that we need to bring in. So it's done in a much more controlled way, which means we are not reliant on pre-arranged overtime in the way that we were before.
Thank you. So in addition to what you've outlined about appliances being unavailable, are there any other reasons that might impact their availability?
Well, there are a number of reasons why appliances will come off the run. So some of those can be technical, so they can do with a mechanical issue with the fire appliance itself. They can be due to things like partial absence, so firefighters will have to go and do a medical examination, for example, or they'll have to go and do a fitness test. So the pumps off the run is actually a figure that goes up and down on literally on an hour-by-hour basis, because you've got these movements of staff to go and do different pieces of work. That has an impact in terms of the appliances that we've got available. But critically, what we have is the dynamic cover tool down in control, which means our control officers are able to move resources around, as the name suggests, in a dynamic way, which means we never compromise our response standards. And so where we may have a pinch point in a particular area, control have got the ability to move our resources around to make sure that our response standards still remain at 6 and 8. And that's been something that they do on a day-to-day basis. It's bedded into our concept of operations, which means we can be very flexible in terms of how we use our resources, which was something, of course, we did have to do last year over the summer period because of the particular operational challenges that we faced.
Great. And then my final question, Chair, is around the report stating that a lack of PPE had prevented some staff from being available, and particular issues around protective equipment for female firefighters. Yeah. I wonder what action you have taken to address this. And I'm going to ask you also a cheeky question, not part of the report, but I visited a fire station in my constituency a short while back, and one of the things that I raised with the station commander was menstrual products. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder, we had a very interesting conversation there, but I just wonder, in the greater scheme, obviously PPE is that more life limit, if you can't have the right PPE, you can't get out and fight fires, but I just wonder what actions you've taken to make sure that female firefighters are accommodated.
So again, if I take the first question, so in terms of PPE, there was particular challenges with Bristol, who we're part of a national procurement around PPE. So because you had 11 other, I think it was, fire and rescue services also declare a major incident on the 19th of July, and Bristol have got the national PPE contract. As an organisation, they understandably came under pressure in terms of the amount of PPE that was being made available and how quickly it could be laundered and then got back to services. So London wasn't unique in that. That was a problem that was seen nationally. Now, we raised that with Bristol to make sure that they are prepared this time round, that actually should we get a repeat of what we saw last year, that we're able to bring in additional PPE as it's required. You're absolutely right. There was a particular challenge around female PPE because of the numbers and the sizes that were available. So again, we've made sure that Bristol have been able to supply additional female PPE, because we should never be in that position that female firefighters are disadvantaged because we haven't got enough personal protective equipment. We're absolutely committed to that, and we're working very closely with Bristol to make sure that the pinch points that we saw last year are not repeated this year. In terms of the welfare provision for female firefighters, that is something we need to continue to come back to. So what we did after the 19th of July last year was we ran a hot debrief with Red Watch, who had responded to the incident, and the overwhelming feedback was around the welfare provision, particularly toilet facilities. So where you've got firefighters committed to incidents as they were last year for anywhere between sort of 9 and 15 hours, we needed to, and they were absolutely right, we needed to significantly improve what our welfare offer was. And so we've been able to work through contracts this year to make sure that if we have significant and protracted incidents, we're able to deploy hygiene facilities to the incident ground in a way that we weren't able to do last year. And that was as a result of direct feedback, particularly from female firefighters. There is a question around sort of welfare packs to make sure that female firefighters have got everything that they need in order to do the job that we ask them to do, and I think that's something we have to keep coming back to. There's a small team called the Positive Improvement Team who report directly into me now, and that includes members of the Women's Action Committee, because one of the things, since the Culture Review actually was published at the end of November, is where we see these particular issues with particular staff groups, that is now raised to me directly, which means where we know there is a particular problem, we can do something about it, and we can do something about it quickly. So if we've got challenges around uniform, if we've got challenges around PPE, if we've got challenges around welfare, they are able to escalate that to me directly, and then we can do something about it, which is something we didn't have.
No, that's really helpful. I only raise it because it was described to me that it was a procurement decision and not necessarily something that could be taken locally. So I just would put that challenge down. I mean, the police have today, in their report that they've launched, said that they're providing menstrual products, and the GLA is also doing the same. I just think if it's a necessary but small but necessary part of what's provided to encourage female firefighters and to be able to kind of do those long shifts. But I think it's I completely agree, and that's something that Mostaque and I will be able to take away from it. If there is a particular procurement challenge that we need to overcome, because you're absolutely right, we need to make sure that people are treated properly and they've got everything they need to do the job that we ask them to do.
Okay, thank you very much. And Assemblymember Hall has a supplemental.
Thank you. I've been told to be really quick, Jonathan. So what is the maximum amount of appliances available each day? So what is the maximum?
So we can, if we're accruing everything, we'd have 142 pumping appliances available on any given day, and then we've got a number of specialist vehicles on top of that.
Okay, so what is the average of unavailable appliances?
Well, the challenge with that is that it varies from day to day. Yeah. So we'll have some days where we will have single-digit numbers that are unavailable, and then we'll have others where we get up to anywhere in the region of 19 and 20. But because of this priority crewing guide that we've got in place, where we start to see pinch points, particularly if we come into things like summer holidays, for example, we then use pre-arranged overtime to make sure that we're never getting above that threshold, so we don't get into the situation where we've got 39 pumps off the run, for example.
Okay, so what number sends an alert to you? What number do you start getting really concerned about?
So if we start to get over 15 pumps off the run, then we will look to see what additional resources we can bring in through pre-arranged overtime or crewing in a different way. But that will also be matched against the recall arrangements. So if we've got a number of firefighters who are doing breathing apparatus training on it, which again varies from day to day, I know I've got additional resource that I can bring in, which means we can be even more flexible and intelligent in terms of how many pumps we would tolerate coming off the run.
Okay, how many times have you gone over 15 in the last 2 months?
I would need to come back with that exact figure, but not many, because we've set that threshold around 15, and we've given permission that if it gets over 15, we will then use pre-arranged overtime.
Okay.
The challenge you also get is with sickness and with special leave that comes in right at the last minute. So one of the other things we've done is we've changed the way that firefighters are able to draw their leave down right at the last minute, because it means it gives our central planning team the opportunity to really work out what we need and if we need to bring in additional overtime. But sickness can be a challenge, last minute leave can be a challenge, which is why we're tweaking the way we're doing
and
it.
August can be a challenge. We both know that.
The summer period can be a challenge.
Yeah, and has been for every single year I've been involved. Thank you.
Okay, Member Cooper.
Thank you, and apologies for arriving late, but this is a very interesting discussion. Very grateful that you've come in to answer these questions. I want to go back to wildfires. Obviously, we had 40 degrees heat in London last year. We know what's going on across Europe at the moment. It's higher than 40 degrees. I don't think it's come any earlier than many people actually in the scientific community thought. I think we've been warned about this for a long time. I think perhaps people beyond the scientific community are the ones who are shocked. So it's really important that we're as prepared as possible from the fire brigade to make sure that the next time it turns up, which could be in a few weeks' time, or it could be next year, we don't know, that we are as ready as we can be. Would you say that we are now more ready than we were last year?
Yes, I can say with real confidence that as a result of the learning of last year, that we are in a much better position this year than we were. But I always caveat that there's still an awful lot more we can do. You know, I just think the nature of what we are seeing, some of those excess temperatures, and if we're asking firefighters to operate in arduous conditions where the external temperature is 42 degrees, for example, as they face in Rome today, that places particular challenges on our operational staff. And we need to work that through, which is why, you know, Paul's team are looking at things like the appropriate PPE. What additional measures can we bring in to make sure that welfare is appropriate, to make sure we're able to recycle crews quickly, that you don't have people committed to an incident for 9 or 10 hours at a time, because to be able to operate in that heat is just not sustainable.
Well, I don't think it's fair. I think that's the point.
It's
really.
Not fair at all.
It's the fairness of asking people to do that.
I agree.
And so I'm very, very pleased to hear you mentioning PPE straight up. As you know, last year at the Fire Committee, I was asking whether or not we had done enough to have separate PPE for summer uniform. You've just brought out this review on the 10th of July, and the research findings on PPE were presented to the Clothing Board in May. Can you tell us what progress has been made, and this might be one for Paul then to go into the detail on this, and whether firefighters will now have specific hot weather kit that they'll be able to wear?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. With your permission, I'll hand over to Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much. So from our findings, the major incident review, a number of papers were generated, of which one of the extreme weather response paper 2023 was presented to GLA on the 17th of May. In that details the update on the research that we're undertaking. So we have a number of manufacturers that provide what we call non-structural PPE. PPE, personal protective equipment that allows us to fight fires outside, arguably in a rural environment. What we have to understand is the ability of that equipment to be used in a rural-urban interface, and the transition between the two. So we've got a number of trial packs that have been delivered to our door now that are due to go out to one, if not two, fire stations to understand what that looks like over the summer. What I'm pleased to say is the equipment that we've seen so far, and working with our employee support groups, has been met with a real positivity. And what I mean by that is that it works, you know, for all different sizes and demographics of our workforce. B, it is lightweight in terms of wearing. C, it means that we can easily launder it, because what I have to do is bring together the protective elements of that equipment with decontamination as a clear and strong line for our own workforce and the safety of our firefighters. So as we roll that out, I'm anticipating an 8 to 12 week trial across our fire stations. I'll receive that information back, translate that into a business case, and return to my colleagues to my left and right with the request, really, of whether we take this forward or not. What is really, really important is, A, that it's right for the urban-rural interface of London, B, it's right for our firefighters across all of our demographics, and C, we can get it to operate quickly if we decide to purchase.
Yes, because my colleague, Assemblymember Moema, was just picking up some of the issues that had emerged about PPE, for example, for female firefighters. So it definitely does need to be fit for everybody. Can I just turn to the issue of water? So it might be something for Jonathan to reply on, but also, Alex, it would probably be helpful if you can come in at this point as well. We have the situation where sometimes there is issues relating to water pressure reduction. Are there better information sharing going on should that occur? Because obviously in this kind of situation there might be a huge demand from the brigade in certain particular specific locations, Wennington being a very obvious one last year.
Yeah, so it's a really important question in terms of my colleagues in Thames Water will come in, but there is an app now that's available to our bulk media advisors, who are our tactical advisors within the London Fire Brigade when it comes to the management of water resources incidents. Now they have a tablet where they can use the app that's provided by Thames Water, which means we can sense check the flow rates coming from hydrants in any particular area. So we know if we're going to a particular area, our bulk media advisors are able to look on their tablet, they're able to use the app to actually understand what the flow rates within that area are, and they're then able to advise senior incident commanders about whether or not we would put a request in to Thames Water to increase the flow rates, but depending on what we've got in front of them. We have regular meetings with Thames Water, so there's a monthly meeting with an officer who sits in Paul's department with Thames Water, and we have escalation routes that if there are particular issues that we're facing, we're able to speak to Thames Water to address them. But on a purely operational level, we're able to access information and make decisions based on, the particular challenges that I won't speak for Thames Water, but the particular challenges that Thames Water will have at any one time in any particular area. Especially if you're dealing in a hot weather scenario where the demand on water is clearly going to be higher. That's something we need to manage and make sure that water for firefighting is prioritised in those areas, but that's an ongoing communication. But the technology that's now available for our bulk media advisors is a significant improvement for us in terms of being able to make those decisions going forward. But with the permission of the Chair, I'll just pause.
You were actually anticipating my next question, which was about whether or not the app was up and running, but certainly I know from examination, I have a water smart meter, and if I look at my bills last year, I can see that in July I was using probably about 3 times as much water because I have a garden and got the hose out and was watering things in my garden. And I know that lots of other people will have been doing the same, apart from the fact, obviously, that probably some of us shower more and things like that to keep cool. So I don't know whether that's Alex or Simon would like to come in on the issues of people like me using more water just at the time when the fire brigade might be desperate for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up that question. So good morning, everyone. Absolutely, it's a genuine issue, and it's been really good to speak to colleagues at the London Fire Brigade about how successful that app has been so far. So it was brought into sort of active use in 2020. So we've been working on this app's development. We call it the Fire Flow system. Does exactly what it says on the tin. So what it shows is there's around 76,000 fire hydrants on Thames Water's network across London, which are the property of the London Fire Brigade, but obviously the water in them is supplied by ourselves, and a further 85,000 washouts, which are, to all intents and purposes, the same equipment, the same piece of infrastructure, but they are installed by ourselves for sort of water quality and network management reasons. So the app itself shows the kind of the likely sort of minimum maximum flow rates from those hydrants and washouts to enable sort of better event planning and event response by the London Fire Brigade to enable them to sort of get to the best hydrant sort of first time, rather than any particular trying different hydrants to see what might have a different flow rate, because it might be supplied by a different section of our water network. In terms of availability of water, obviously we keep a close eye on levels of water within the aquifers and the reservoirs which supply London, and as you'll be aware, there was the call to bring in a temporary use ban, or a hosepipe ban as it's known sort of colloquially, towards the end of August last year, which our customers and water users in our region responded really well to, which is essential. And those bans are brought in at a particular threshold, which is sort of pre-agreed with the Environment Agency, and they're a huge sort of a hugely important tool for us as a responsible water undertaker to make sure that we manage the availability of water. It was very widely noted last year. Obviously, we had the hottest day in sort of recent history, and there's also a very prolonged dry period that followed that as well. So that ban continued sort of until it may have felt a little wetter sort of towards the end of that time period. But it takes a while for the aquifers to restock.
Top back up.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. So yeah, exactly. So we recognise that usage goes up in the summer. Our smart metering programme, where we have around 800,000 metres on customers' properties, that will increase to around 1 million metres by the end of this investment period, 2025. That will give us much better visibility of what our customers are using, help us to perhaps anticipate periods of high usage better, and sort of where those sort of types of properties are, that such as, by sounds of it, yourself, where there's a garden involved in making sure that we can supply water to the best of our ability. But obviously prioritising water for sort of event response for the fire brigade is a really high priority for us. And during an event, we would take actions such as we can to divert water, increase pressures, make sure that ultimately that flows are available for that purpose.
And has there ever been an incident where water has not been available for multiple different hydrants that are very close to a large incident that you're aware of?
I have to say, I have to get back to you on that one. Not that I'm immediately aware of, but to say that there's a large number of hydrants, and what our technicians that would be called out to support those kind of large events at the request of the fire brigade, what they would do is to try and seek the best available sources of water. And there would be, I think, a number of different options for the event responders, and that may include accessing water from rivers or swimming pools, or whatever might be available to supplement the water supply from the network, if that was so required.
Well, it would be interesting to know if that had ever happened before, so I'd be grateful if you could supply that information, just to see if there's any learnings that we can gain from that. Was it in the summer and that sort of thing. My final question, I think I'm probably going to come back to the fire brigade, but thank you for your help with that on the water supply side. Again, my colleague Assembly Member Moema was just touching on welfare support, and obviously the issue of being able to rotate people through who so that they don't do 9 or 10 hours in a wildfire is really important. Have you improved the procedures for making sure that there's welfare support, so that if people are coming straight out of the fire, maybe they might have cool packs, ice packs that they can access immediately, water for drinking, that sort of thing, on-board appliances? Are we doing more to make sure that people can immediately be helped in that way? I'm conscious, obviously, we're asking people to put on protective equipment and go into something that's even hotter than the surrounding air in this situation. So just wondering how we're dealing with that.
Yes, so I mean the welfare provision is one of the key areas that we learned very quickly as a result of the debrief from last year, because quite rightly a number of our staff, pushed back in terms of the welfare provision that was required at the time. One thing we have done is we've revised our strategic response arrangements, and we've exercised that over the course of the last 2 to 3 weeks. So everyone from Deputy Assistant Commissioner up to Deputy Commissioner has been through a training package around our new strategic response arrangements, which in a nutshell means we would not respond to these wildfires in the same way that we did last year. And what I mean by that is that we would make sure that we were operating much smarter in terms of the numbers of crews that we're committing to particular incidents, which means we're then able to hold crews back if the incident should actually then develop in other parts of the capital, as it did last year. At one point last year, we had 15 significant incidents in their own right, and the particular challenge was that they were spread right across the geography of the capital, which is something we hadn't seen before. So we've tested and exercised our new strategic response arrangements, and that means we would operate differently to how we operated last year, and crew welfare is critical to that. So the one thing that incident commanders will need to commit to almost immediately when they respond to these incidents is about what that welfare provision is going to look like. They'll be able to request into control and then up to senior operational commanders relief crews coming in very, very quickly to make sure that people are not committed to incidents in any great length of time. This is where the tactical advisors are really useful, because it means we can think very intelligently about how we deploy our resources, which means we don't, for example, throw 20 pumps or 30 pumps at a particular incident. We think about it in a much more intelligent way than we have done previously. It means using alternative vehicles such as 4x4 capability that we've got down in Biggin Hill now, which means we can use vehicles in a different way, which again is going to mean that we take away the pressure that's put on individual firefighters, because we're using the technology and the capability in a different way to what we saw last year. But welfare couldn't be any more important, and I don't know, Paul, if you want to jump in on a couple of the other technical details around how we've improved it.
Thank you, Jonathan. So in terms of, what does it mean to be a firefighter in those conditions? The hydration packs are there. There's still some more work to be done around how we can actually improve volume and scale our sheltering arrangements, things like overhead shelters to allow firefighters to get into the shade. This is some of the learning that we're taking from the current European position that we're monitoring, and through the research teams and the international research that we've done previously, is understanding actually how do you cool a firefighter when they've come out of 42 degrees heat, and there is no air conditioning available because you're in a rural area. So there's a piece of work that's ongoing at the moment. We're working with trade unions to support that piece of work, to understand from their learning and their outreach abilities. So in the long and the short, really sort of panel is that there is more work to do, but from a firefighter's perspective, they should see a real and marked difference from sun hats to hydration packs, better toileting and welfare facilities, better hygiene facilities, better feeding on the incident ground, and the strategic reserve that Jonathan mentioned around sort of how we rotate crews in and out to ensure that they are ready to go on to the next job so we can maintain our response standards in the wider business as usual arrangements back in the city.
I was just going to add to that, Chair, as well. One of the other things we've done is we've given, actually this is quite a simple change, but it is going to make a difference. So our Deputy Assistant Commissioners and our Borough Commanders now have access to corporate credit cards. That actually means if they're in a particular scenario where we need to supplement what our welfare provision looks like, whether it's additional sandwiches or bottles of water, it can actually be done very, very quickly without any delay in terms of how that operates. So again, that's just another simple tactical change that we've made that means that we can get welfare provision to people quickly when they need it, rather than any delay that's built into our processes.
Well, thank you very much for those answers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I just want to quickly welcome Shalom Noam School, which is a primary school in my constituency. So they're based in Burnt Oak, so we're very, very welcome. Today we are discussing, we've got the London Fire Brigade and we have Thames Water, and we are discussing how the Fire Brigade is prepared to meet the challenges of climate change. So as our weather is getting hotter and drier and we're starting to see more things like wildfires, how is the Fire Brigade equipped to keep our city safe and to keep all of you safe as well? So you're very, very welcome. I hope you enjoy. And now I'm going to hand over to Assemblymember Hall.
Thank you, Jonathan. You again, and I've been told to be quick again, so apologies. Many councils were not mowing verges because of rewilding, and they really got very high, and obviously with the weather, if it dries it all out, there's a concern there. There's also, because of financial reasons, many councils don't cut and collect, so they leave the grass there, which dries up and works as a tinder. Have you actually looked at that as something that could cause a problem?
Yes, we absolutely have. So in terms of, the management of land is critical to how we're going to take this forward. So again, that was one of the reasons we wrote to local chief executives on the 19th of June, outlining the fact that we needed to see the land managed in a sensible way, because there would be particular challenges. We've got our crews out and about in local areas where we know there are issues, to be our eyes and ears on the ground and report any particular challenges back to us. Some of the things we've done actually is use the fire cadets to help with land management and cutting areas down and helping us to manage, thinking quite innovatively in terms of what we do. But there is, of course, a responsibility on local authorities and other partners to assist us in that work, to give us a fighting chance to manage the land in the right way. But of course, understanding that there will be rightfully a commitment to rewilding and what that looks like. But we have to get that balance right between the two.
And the response from the chief executives?
So the response from the chief executives has been good. There are logistical challenges in terms of areas that they need to cut back, and in terms of their commitments around rewilding and making sure they're managing the land in the right way. But everybody understands what happened, last year in places like Wennington and Dagenham and Upminster and others, and understands the responsibility that sits on their shoulders. And working in partnership with us to make sure that we are getting that balance right between managing the land appropriately to take away the risk of wildfire, but at the same time also supporting, all of those efforts to rewild areas, which, again, we would support. But it's that balance that we have to keep coming back.
So how do you flag where you've got an area where the rewilding or the cutting and not collecting is quite vast? What will you do if they're not playing ball? Because
So again, our local crews will come back into us as part of the work that they're doing at a station level. So if there's a particular challenge in a particular area, they're able to escalate that, and then we're able to write directly to local authorities and have that conversation. And we've got those partnership arrangements at a local level to be able to do that. And by and large, when you're actually having those discussions with partners, they understand the position that we're taking. And actually are very responsive to try and manage the land in the right way. But it's a constant dialogue that we have to keep coming back to. It's why we're being much more proactive around how we deploy our crews on the front line. So when we've got particular pinch points where we know the temperatures are starting to rise, we're sending our crews out to areas such as Wanstead Flats, for example, where they'll go out and have a look. And if there are particular areas that we've got concerns about, we're able to escalate that appropriately and have those conversations. But that's something we have to keep coming. Back to.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Schick.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the panel. Good to have you here with us and to those in the gallery. Really, really important discussion. I mean, we often talk about sort of future mitigation when it comes to climate change, but sort of real-time adaptation is essential, especially the London Fire Brigade being on the front line of this crisis and how we manage it in London specifically. So we've talked a lot about wildfires this morning, and I think although we've gone into some of the specifics, especially with the follow-ups from my committee members, I was wondering if we could take a step back and go into sort of, again, broad areas of sort of what we hope to achieve. So I'll start with yourself, Jonathan, and just say, can you tell us what the LFB hopes that the National Fire Chiefs Council, National Working Group on Wildfires can deliver?
Well, the one thing that working group does deliver is real expertise. So we've worked very closely with the Chief Fire Officer in Northumberland, a chap called Paul Headley, who's been really helpful in terms of, so particularly the learning that we took away from the wildfires from last year, the packages that have been delivered to our frontline firefighters, the tactical advisor courses that have been delivered to our flexi-duty officers as a result of that working relationship with the National Fire Chiefs Council. Because although last year was a particular challenge for London Fire Brigade, because we hadn't quite seen that interaction between the rural and the urban in the way that we saw last year, for other colleagues who've been operating, particularly up in areas like Northumbria or Greater Manchester or West Yorkshire, this is something that they've been consistently dealing with over a number of years and have specific expertise. So one of the things I'm pleased that London Fire Brigade now really does do, as a result of learning from Grenfell, actually, the truth be told, is really look out and understand that there are expertise that exists both nationally and internationally, and the National Fire Chiefs Council Wildfire Working Group has been extremely helpful to us in making sure that we posture ourselves this year in a much better way than we did last year, and that's a continuing working relationship. We've got officers who sit on those working groups. I attend the National Fire Chiefs Council Operations Committee, of which Paul Headley provided a presentation last week around the challenges of wildfire. So we're very much open to learning from other services who have got more experience in this space than we have, and we're now starting to see that play out in terms of how we're training and equipping our staff.
That's really reassuring to hear. Thank you. And you've obviously talked about the National Fire Chiefs Council and the work that you're doing, and they've recently reinstated the National Wildfire Tactical Advisor role. So can you just clarify, does the LFB intend to have its own wildfire tactical advisor?
Yeah, so we absolutely do. So our ambition is to have, and I'll let Paul jump in here with some of the detail, but with the permission of the chair. But essentially, our ambition is to have 4 nationally recognised tactical advisors, and there's an important difference there because that's effectively your level 4 capability. So that means you have those officers who are able to be deployed nationally as well as locally, because they have that real high-end expertise, and there's all sorts of CPD that needs to go with that to achieve that qualification. There's then level 3 that sits underneath that, which is around our tactical advisors that we've already trained up, so we've got 30 of those. Then you've got level 2 that sits under that provide a lower level advisory role. And then you've got our level 1, which has been delivered to all frontline firefighters and junior officers on fire stations. So it's absolutely our ambition to have 4. We've currently got 1 officer who was a nationally recognised tactical wildfire advisor because he was served in another brigade, and we're now getting him back up skilled to be in that position moving forward, because what you have to do is accrue a number of CPD hours actually at wildfires in order to regain the qualification. So he will need to go around the country as and when these fires are developing in order to gain that experience to get that qualification. But because of the risk and challenge we know we're going to continue to face as an organisation, we want to have 4 of those level 4 officers within London, but there is the chance that they could also be deployed nationally because they'll sit as part of our national resilience arrangements.
Okay, I can see how the logistics around the completion of the training being sort of related to actually experience of wildfires can make having a timeline on that a little bit more tricky, but I don't know if Paul wanted to add to that.
Yeah, thank you. So in addition to the level 4 capability that we're currently growing, I think it might be useful to members if I just quickly walk through the appendix on the report I referred to earlier, which is the course content overview, just to give you an idea of the capabilities that we have been growing. It'll take about 10 to 20 seconds with your permission, Chair. So level 1 is training modules that cover the following sort of wildfire terminology, map reading, topography, the ability to read the ground and read where the fire is going, weather impacts upon wildland firefighting, fuel loading within the environment, and the wildfire prediction systems that are available to us, including obviously safety protocols for safe systems of work and suppression tactics that John alluded to earlier on, such as controlled burns. The level 2 course is done in greater detail, taught by an NFCC accredited subject matter expert with practical elements to that and a formal theory assessment that is accredited to confirm knowledge and understanding. And then moving further to the advanced level 3, that builds upon sort of the modules I've talked about. It has to be undertaken in a rural setting, and delegates must demonstrate the theory that they've learnt on the level 2. There is a practical assessment again to confirm knowledge and understanding, with exercise and role players to confirm that delegates have met the required standards. And then moving through, John has quite adequately discussed the level 4 capability. So I truly believe that within the next sort of 12 to 18 months, London Fire Brigade will deliver a first-class capability on the ground to support our teams in responding to wildfires.
Thank you very much. And then just on to my final question. So obviously we've talked about implementing the recommendations from the Major Incident Review. And I wanted some clarity on how much resource has been allocated to delivering these recommendations and where it's being drawn from elsewhere from the LFB.
I'll come in with the highlight. So we've done this within our current budget framework. So one of the things when we've had to reprioritise work elsewhere. So particularly within Paul's department, within operational assurance, operational policy and assurance, that because we've seen as a result of the wildfires that we experienced last year, and obviously the recommendations from the Major Incident Review, and this was part of the point I was making before about being able to pivot as an organisation where we see the most risk and where we need to put additional resource. So this year we've been able to manage it within our current financial envelope, but we are going through our budget submissions for the next financial year for 24-25 and beyond, and we will be planning in there additional resource that we're going to need in order to manage this ongoing risk going forward. But it's one of the things I'm pleased about, that we've been able to make these changes in the 12 months since the wildfires of last year, but we've done it within our current budget envelope by reprioritising and focusing on wildfire provision, because as the questions that the committee have already alluded to, this was something where we knew we had a gap in our capability, we had a gap in our knowledge and expertise, and we needed to address it quickly before we got to this summer, accepting the fact that there's still other areas for us to do.
No, and I think that pivot's fantastic, and to be able to identify that knowledge gap and that expertise gap and be able to fill it so quickly. So just, I think, fantastic that it's been able to be encompassed within the current budget. But just to clarify, does that mean that resources have been redrawn from other areas that were previously allocated in the budget?
Yeah, so we've had to think, laterally in terms of other areas that were perhaps more longer term in terms of what we were dealing with, to make sure that we've got officers and project capability around, even some of in areas that Mostaque has responsibility around procurement, for example. So, actually going out and procuring the sun hats that we wanted to do, we had to do that at pace. Because of the scale and size of London Fire Brigade, that can be a complex procurement exercise. So it's not just been from an operational perspective, it's about how the entire organisation comes together, focused on the risk that we've identified, and then we're able to move at pace. And the good thing is it demonstrates that when we do that, we can move at pace once we've identified a risk that's presented itself, and it's where I'm so grateful for our enabling services that are actually supporting us to deliver the response that we need by allowing us to move through what can be very complicated procurement arrangements in order to deliver, because quite rightly, a firefighter on the front line is not interested in complicated procurement. And what they want to know is they've got the right kit, equipment and training to do the job that we ask them to do. And so we've been able to do that, I'm pleased to say. But there is an ongoing piece around what additional resource we may well need going forward to help mitigate the risk as we see it developing.
No, that's really helpful, thank you, although I would say that maybe the committee is interested in complicated procurement, hence the questions. So I think Mostaque has indicated, so just some clarity specifically on where the resources have been drawn from would be grand. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we've been fortunate in a number of the areas of recommendations that actually we were doing other work for other reasons where we've been able to kind of utilise that for implementing these recommendations. So when I look at the recommendations, a lot around the national operational guidance and how we embed that in the London Fire Brigade, which Paul was leading a project for wider reasons, and actually we've been able to kind of incorporate some of this. John mentioned our approach to training as a watch and managing pre-range overtime, again, for wider reasons before the kind of wildfire issues came along. We need to tackle that issue, and actually that has an ongoing benefit in terms of resilience and how we manage our workforce. So we've been able to, fortunately, latch on to other work that was happening that has a benefit in this space. But there will come a time where my kind of chief officer, where we will require, going forward, additional financial resources to be built into our budget planning round, as mentioned. So an example is, yes, we're piloting the more lightweight PPE at the moment. That's a small-scale pilot at the moment. We need to see what works. But if we were to roll that out across the brigade, that will require significant more financial resources, and we'll have a business case and factor that in. Earlier, it was mentioned potential use of technology such as increased use of drones. That will cost more over the long term, so we'll need to factor that into our investment planning. So short term, yes, we've been able to manage with existing resources, but going forward, we need to factor that into our future investment planning.
That's really helpful. I mean, I suppose that's sort of the intention behind the questions, really. It's like being able to identify, for instance, where it's been redrawn from currently, because that need might grow in the future, and we want to be able to support making the case and the business case for that, particularly around lightweight equipment, because I recently visited a fire brigade and I tried on that equipment, and as fabulous as it looks, it is bloody heavy and hot. So a huge admiration to all of the London Fire Brigade on the front line. But yeah, thank you for answering that question, and I think really fantastic work to be able to adapt in the current budget to meet the needs. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And we've just received another group of visitors, but unfortunately I haven't been given a note as to who they are. So welcome. Today we're talking about climate change and the ability of the London Fire Brigade to adapt to the challenges arising from hotter and drier weather. Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you very much, Chair. Could I just ask you briefly, picking up on Assemblymember Hall's point about this trade-off or so-called trade-off between vegetation and wildfires. I think you mentioned to me last time, or a few months ago, that there was going to be a report around managing vegetation. Is there a date for when that report's due to be published?
I would need to check that, if that's okay, Assemblymember Polanski. So that, yeah, I need to recall that information. I have not seen that report. So, if with the permission of the chair, I'll look into that and then come back to you.
Thank you. Just for clarity, I don't think the report's been published yet, but I think it was in the works. So it might not have been you who said it to me, to be fair to you. What advice have you provided to local authorities and Londoners around the risk of wildfires, particularly for this year?
So we've launched a number of campaigns, particularly around the use of things like disposable barbecues, and we've called on local authorities to ban the use of disposable barbecues in parkland and an area where you've got public open spaces, which has been well received. A number of the supermarkets have also responded to that. So Asda, Morrison's, Tesco's, and Sainsbury's also do not sell those disposable barbecues. There are some challenges around garages that still continue to sell small disposable barbecues, which is something our protection team is focusing on to try and dissuade people from doing that. It's also about sensible rubbish collection and making sure that land is managed and rubbish is collected efficiently and effectively, that it doesn't become a fire risk. Smoking materials, to make sure that people are very careful in terms of how they discard smoking materials. Signage is a really important one. So colleagues in Australia are very, very big on the use of signage to make sure that at particular parts of the year, it's very, very clear that you need to manage your behaviour and how you conduct yourself in open spaces in particular. because of the risk of wildfire, which is something we're looking to continue to encourage. The use of fire breaks. So where we can, actually there's the options of changing the layout of the land, that you actually create a fire break so that you won't see the spread of fire in the way that we saw last year. And we're backing that up with constant tweeting, with press releases, to make sure that this is continuing in the public consciousness, because there is an awful lot we can do to prevent these fires from happening in the first place if people just moderate their behaviour and think about what it is they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. I'd add that we did have a guest previously who talked about roads being a fire break, and I would just point out that we need no new roads because that's partly causing the whole problem in the first place. How many wildfires has London Fire Brigade responded to this year?
Well, I'd need to come back with the exact figure, but we've responded to one 10-pump wildfire, which was in Enfield 3 to 4 weeks ago, and then we've had I know we have had a number of smaller 4 and 6 pump incidents, but so far what we haven't seen is the uptick in the numbers that we saw last year, but I would need, with the permission of the Chair, come back and write to you with the exact figure.
Thank you. I've got 2 brief supplementaries, which I'm flagging to the Chair because I know they're not loving my supplementaries today. But in Canada, we've seen with the wildfires that air quality has been one of the huge issues around the obvious danger of the fire itself. What work is being done around potentially warning people of the risks to their lungs and to their health from a wildfire? So it's not just about the physical danger of the fire, it's about the air quality as well.
So I think that's probably an area of work that we need to improve on in terms of some of the health elements. So as I was saying before, one of the challenges with the heat that we saw last year was so when the London Resilience Forum was starting to look at it, and actually when we started to see SCGs being called, it was around the health emergency around heat first and foremost, because quite understandably there's significant pressure put on the National Health Service, whether it's to do with the sheer heat itself or whether it's to do with air quality that can change obviously when the temperature increases. I think that probably is an area for us to improve on in terms of how we work with the National Health Service in terms of the advice and guidance that we're providing, because at the moment it's predominantly around the prevention of wildfires from occurring. But I think you raise a very sensible point that there's more that we can do working with local partners to actually highlight the risk that can also occur in terms of air quality. So something that we need to develop, I think.
There's a lot to think about. I don't envy your job. And the final thing is we've all had the experience of where railway tracks contract and expand during experiences of heat. I believe it's called the geothermal envelope. We've also seen around southern Europe, this is happening with roads now and roads melting. Is there any work being done around infrastructure and the protection of infrastructure and actually how you adapt if roads do melt and the kind of further impacts from that?
So again, it's where the local approach is so critical. So working with local authorities who tend to have responsibility, certainly for the local road networks, in terms of the responsibility that sits with them, so that when we get particular issues with the infrastructure, not just in terms of excessive heat causing tarmac to melt, potholes to develop, that we are actually informed very, very quickly, because and to be fair, the local authorities are good at that. Where there's particular challenges around local infrastructure, transport infrastructure in particular, there are mechanisms that are able to inform not just us but all of the emergency services that we will then factor into how we deploy, and that ends up in our control room so that they can think about what resources are deployed where if there's a particular area. But again, I think this is something we're going to need to keep coming back to, because the infrastructure will suffer if we start to see 40, 41, 42 degree heat on a regular basis. At the moment, we're not set up to be able to deal with that. So again, as talking the point before about this being a team sport, we're going to have to work very, very closely with local authorities and developers in terms of making sure we're factoring that into how we build the infrastructure of the future that's able to mitigate the impacts of climate change over the medium and longer term.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I've just been reliably informed the group we have is the Summer School of Catherine West MP, so you're very welcome. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk a little bit more about the education part of your work that you're doing and the advice that you're giving, and on terms of what you've learned with the last of these wildfires. Has it impacted your work and the formulation of any of your personal emergency evacuation plans work that you've been doing as well?
So in terms of actually managing evacuation, so one of the big lessons that we've learned is how you manage evacuation. If you take Wellington as an example last year, where you had that real rural-urban interface, and the fire was developing very, very quickly, and we had to evacuate homes quickly in order to do that. There's a lot that we've taken away from that in terms of how you because essentially what you were dealing with there is an entire village. When it comes to particularly vulnerable members of the community and how we manage and evacuate them, that is absolutely part of the incident commander's planning and preparation. And again, this comes down to our tactics that we deploy at an incident, that we prioritise where the life risk is. You would have probably seen the press release that was done last week in terms of some additional equipment that we've got called Holy Hose, which, as the name suggests, is literally a line of hose that have got 6mm drilled holes in, but essentially acts. But what it does is it acts as a sprinkler. And the way you can do that is so if you take Wennington as a case in point, where we know the fire is developing, we're able to deploy that hose and then actually soak the ground that should then stop the fire from encompassing, or encroaching, I should say, onto the village. Now, we've got that additional equipment that's available, and that's part of our tactical deployment, but it's about prioritising life risk. So where we know we've got vulnerable members of the community, because we've been doing our borough risk management plans, we understand where that vulnerability exists. It means that factors into our incident command decisions on the ground, that we prioritise where life risk is, and if that means we can't deploy to another scene of operations in order to prioritise that life risk, that is absolutely what we will do, which is where the tactical advice comes in.
And on that note for education, are you working closely with councillors to make sure that they're getting that right information when they're feeding back to their residents as well?
Absolutely. So if you look at what Havering Council have done in particular as a really good exemplar of what can be done by working cross-agency, we had that discussion at this committee actually when we were looking at resilience more broadly. That there's a wildfire committee within Havering Council that looks at these challenges right across all of the agencies that are involved. We would really like to see that rolled out across all of the boroughs in London, because it's only by doing that multi-agency work that you can really identify where your vulnerabilities are, and then we will put that into our operational plans. Heaven forbid we end up having to do it, but if we do, we know where those vulnerabilities are because we've had those conversations with partner agencies.
So it's a good example from Havering that many councils then could adopt. That's great. Yeah. And I hope that goes across to businesses as well. Is that the cross approach, the schools as well?
So they're
colleges?
All, absolutely. Yeah. So they're all part of it. It's having that genuine
Brilliant.
Partnership approach on this particular subject area, because it does have to be multi-agency, because, as I say, no one agency has all of the options within their armoury.
On making sure that no one's missing out, I also want to talk about animal welfare as well. And I was looking at BBC News today about the impact that the wildfires are having and the heat impact on animals. Are you working with the London city farms and zoos as well, and making sure that they're aware of how to deal with the impact that wildfires could have on them?
Well, we've got operational plans. So if with zoos and other areas where we know that we've got a large concentration of animals, we do have good partnership relationships with those organisations. Funny enough, during all of our planning and preparation for the King's coronation and indeed the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, we worked very, very closely with animal welfare charities and with the military in particular and the police when we had large numbers of animals coming into London. And we've got some expertise as far as animal rescue is concerned. Our FRU units have expertise around how you manage animal rescue, and we've got operational plans for zoos and for areas that we've got a large number of livestock. I think there's probably more for us to do, the truth be told, in terms of what else we can do, because you're right, there is an animal welfare issue when it comes to dealing with wildfire, and as a result of these fires moving as quickly as they do, you would have to evacuate livestock in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have had to have done before, because you just don't have the time to intervene.
I'm glad I've raised it. I mean, there are places like, for example, I know in Wimbledon where, we have stables and lots of horses, there's hay, there's things that do light up that we need to kind of consider, and it's an emerging issue that I think we need to highlight. So thank you very much for allowing me that time, Chair. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Can I propose, we have the rest of the meeting we're discussing flooding and mitigation. I suggest we have a comfort break. Shall we come back at 11:30, giving us 6 minutes? Does that sound reasonable? Yeah. Good. Okay, thank you, everyone. Yeah. Are we ready to restart? Okay, great. Assemblymember Bakari is very keen to restart. Here we go. Assemblymember Moema is going to lead us off with questions on flooding.
Thank you. So my question is to Thames Water, to Alex and Simon. Your London flood review identified the need for better coordination to address flash flooding. Are you confident that that's now the case?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I believe we've made some big leaps forward. I mean, it was a shame it took the flooding of July 2021 for us to realise that actually surface water flooding is something that needs everyone to come together on. But I'm very pleased that with the formation of the London Surface Water Strategic Group that brings together all the key players with a responsibility and an interest in surface water flooding. That group has now met 3 times. It has made a very strong commitment to work together on managing surface water flooding. It has a challenging and an active work programme, and I think we are making key strides in that. And that, combined with the publication of our drainage and wastewater management plan, which sets out the challenges to the provision of surface water management and treatment of wastewater in London for the next 25 years, collectively really raises the debate and the capacity to answer some of those questions about how to manage surface water flood risk in London.
Okay. I am particularly interested in this. There's a part of my constituency which, without fail, floods every year. This is prior to any kind of conversations about climate change and so on, and without fail every year the fire brigade do show up to help people in those areas. And I know that you have appeared in front of some local scrutiny commissions, Thames Water that is, but I just wonder what improvements you've made to the area I'm talking about is the marshes along Hackney and Walthamstow marshes, that area. But obviously that's replicated in different parts of the capital. But so I wonder what improvements you've made to drainage and just what people can expect in a bit more granularity, a bit more detail.
So just to remind the committee that the responsibilities of flood risk management in London are diverse. Environment Agency is responsible for flooding from the tide and the main rivers. We are responsible for flooding from any burst water mains, from the foul and combined sewer, and local authorities are responsible for flooding from surface water, ordinary water courses and groundwater. And quite often, the source and cause of flooding is not always immediately transparent, underlining the need for that collaboration. So what we've been doing is working with each of the key partners to try and understand which is the most sort of pressing of those flood risk management needs, and working with them to develop specific plans. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the example that you cite.
No, I wouldn't expect you to be. It's just noting that Thames Water is the body that comes to kind of discuss those issues, because it happens in people's homes in that area. But yeah.
Thank you.
So, did you want to add anything, Simon? Or?
Only that, I mean, when you talked about flooding at Hackney Marshes, I believe there was an incident of a trunk main failure a couple of years ago, which may be one of the incidents you're referring to there in Wick Woodland. That did cause local flooding within the woodland, and we're working closely with Hackney Council and the London Wildlife Trust to try and implement some of the mitigations to protect that asset, which was discovered to be it's quite a shallow asset, a shallow trunk main with quite a lot of trees growing immediately over the top of it, which is not good for a 100-year-old trunk main to have that, and it is something we're working with the local community to try and remove that as a potential sort of cause of any future issues.
Okay, and then just more kind of zooming out then, looking at the rest of London, in terms of your strategy, can you outline some of the improvements that you've made to deal with drainage?
So the drainage and wastewater management plan is a long-term plan. It basically sets out how is growth and climate change together going to impact the performance of our services, and it sets out a number of objectives that were co-created with a wide range of stakeholders to come up with them. It identifies that essentially we need to spend investment of the order of £32 billion needs to be spent over the next 25 years to make the services and the higher outcomes realised by 2050. And what it identifies is investment in things like 7,000 hectares of suds to be able to more sustainably drain areas. This effectively takes the pressure off our drains by slowing and delaying the rate of rainwater entering the system, the need for upsizing about 1,000 kilometres of sewers, the need for about 5 million cubic metres of storage in the network. And what we need to do now is work to create a plan that we will submit to Ofwat in October, setting out how that first stage of that investment is required, and then work with local authorities about how do we take this strategic level plan and translate it to the local level, looking at how can local authorities and other partners through their ways of working help us deliver that. I think what it importantly does is it raises the debate that says that at the moment we don't have an acceptable level of defined flood risk. The DWP starts to show that how many properties are at risk, and if we don't take action, how many more will be at risk at the future, but then also the fact that it should not necessarily fall upon Thames Water bill payers or shareholders to pay for that. This is a societal level of resilience we want to achieve, and we need to have that societal discussion about how it is paid for and how it is sustained in the long term.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's really helpful. My next question is to the Fire Brigade, and just wondered if you have seen improvements across partner organisations to enable them to respond better to local flooding.
Well, I think as Alex has already alluded to, I mean, the one area where I am really pleased to see is now developing is around that strategic group that comes together to address surface area flooding in particular, where you've got the key players in terms of flooding response. One of the challenges that I think Alex has alluded to there is this is a complicated picture in terms of who has responsibility for what. And I think what we have to have is that working group coming together to actually understand how we do all work together in order to deploy our resources in the best possible way to prevent this from happening in the first place, and then obviously manage the response when it comes. As Alex has already alluded to, the strategy that Thames Water have been working on is a longer term plan, so I think it would be unfair of me to make a comment one way or the other in terms of what we've seen any particular improvements. But I think the establishment of that strategic group and then the learning from the flooding that came out back in 2021 means that we are now plugged into the right forums to make sure the views of the Fire and Rescue Service are well known to all of the agencies as we try and manage what we also know is going to be an ongoing risk going forward.
Okay, and just to quickly follow up on that, so does that mean from your perspective, and actually maybe from yours, Alex and Simon, from the Fire Brigade's perspective, the working group clarifies who is responsible for what and when, and therefore for us as a scrutiny body and for Londoners whose homes or businesses may be impacted by flooding, they know who to turn to in the event of, I don't want to say blame, but who is responsible for resolving an issue, because at the moment that's not particularly clear.
Yes, so I think that's one of the main areas that I hope that strategic group is able to do. I know at the moment that they're looking for an independent chair to come and chair that group going forward, and I think clarification of roles and responsibilities and who has responsibility for what, I think is going to be really, really important. So actually, you know, the taxpayers of London understand who's responsible for what, and then we can work together as a partnership to mitigate and prevent these issues from happening in the first place, and then obviously from our perspective, respond accordingly as and when the flooding occurs.
Yeah, I'd say one of the things that's changed since July 2021 is that greater clarity. So on our website and on many of the London Borough websites, the GLA website and London Council's websites, there's now much clearer publicly accessible information about who is responsible for what kind of flooding, who to call, what support you can expect. I think the one thing we've always got to remind Londoners is that there will always be a bigger event, and that will always overcome our systems, and therefore we still need to work with Londoners to make them realise that they have a duty to help protect themselves, and that they have opportunities to help reduce flood risk through the actions they take on their property. So I think there's further work we all need to collectively do under the aegis of the London Surface Water Strategic Group to empower Londoners to become more resilient, while at the same time we work on short, medium and long-term plans to make the capital more resilient.
Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. Let's move on to that event that we were just discussing about the flash flooding in July and how that has impacted the way you're working now. So in the LFB, you're obviously the people that will get the calls when that happens. Have you made some specific improvements on the way you deal with flash flooding?
So we've got significant capability in terms of flood response. As I was saying before, even though we don't have a statutory responsibility around flood response, we do respond as the principal rescue agency, and that includes dealing with flash flooding. So, you know, our fire and rescue units, we have inflatable boats, we have life jackets on every pump, we have throw lines, we have rigid boats that we're also able to deploy from our operational support centre as it's required. I suppose the difference between our response to flooding and our response to wildfire is that we're well practiced now in dealing with flooding events. The events in July 2021 were particularly challenging because it was over such a large area, because effectively what you had was southwest London and northwest London at the same time under significant amounts of water because of the amount of rainfall that fell in such a short period of time. So from an operational perspective, we've got the kit and equipment to be able to deal with flash flooding when it occurs. Some changes that we have made, though, is within our control room. So we have, a command function that is established immediately that we're dealing with wide area flooding, because we will make decisions around how we mobilise, doing something called batch mobilising, for example. So where we've got non-life risk calls, we will batch the calls and then deploy a resource to be able to deal with those calls so that it frees up resource to be able to deal with life risk incidents as and when they occur. So we've taken a lot of the learning from the flash flooding in 2021. We're well positioned as far as our operational response is concerned because we have some experience in this area as opposed to what we had with the types of wildfire that we saw last year. But again, it's something we're going to have to keep coming back to because, again, this threat and risk continues to evolve, and this is going to be a medium and longer term challenge for us to face. But the main changes that we've made since the 21 floods is around how we deploy our resources, how we use our control officers in a more intelligent way to deploy our resources accordingly and prioritise life risk. But there's a bigger piece of work around what we can do to offer flood advice to residents in London to make sure that people understand the risks that they potentially face. So particularly if you've got a basement, you probably saw the tragedy in South Korea over the last few days where a number of people have been killed in subsurface environments as a result of flash flooding. So that's something we need to make sure that we're playing our part to educate people, have an evacuation plan, have an evacuation grab bag, understand that there's a flood line that you can contact 24 hours a day to provide advice, and then of course if you need the fire brigade, to make sure that you're calling 999 and we will come and assist. So there's still ongoing work to be done, but I think as far as our flood response capability is concerned, as a result of the learning from 2021, we're in a good position to respond if required.
We mentioned the leaflet that you're sending to basement properties, and you've sent a copy to the committee, the kind of communication you're doing with basement property specifically. You've talked about the way that you're communicating outside of businesses, again, schools, like my favourite subject, and yep. You're definitely doing that too. But do you think, when you're working with the Mayor's office, that they're picking up on some of the ways that you're promoting preventative ways of preventing flooding? So you've had an award-winning garden, I think, promoted as well. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so there's a number of things. So a number of our fire stations have gardens on them because actually there's lots of benefits to that, both in terms of the contribution that they're making to climate change, but there's also elements around mental health. Actually, where you're creating that environment on fire stations, it's a good area for people to go and de-stress, and some of those gardens are really quite impressive if you've ever seen any of them, and some of them have been award-winning. Now, last year we did have a stand at the Chelsea Flower Show. And the reason that we had the stand there was because we were encouraging people, if you're lucky enough to have a front garden, that one of the things we would discourage is concreting it over, for example, that actually that then adds to the floodplain if you do that. And we were just highlighting that risk, that if you do concrete over areas of green land that you own, there is the potential that that's going to add to the flood risk in the local area. So we had a stand that was running at Chelsea Flower Show, which did win an award. But the important message there was just to have that in people's consciousness and psyche, that you just need to think about your own property and how you're managing it, because there are knock-on impacts in terms of how we manage floodwater.
Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Commissioner, you just talked about call 999 and we will assist, and of course the majority of the time that's absolutely true. We also know from a major incident review report that one of the problems in a major incident is shortage of callers and people able to take those calls. Pulling everything we've been talking about this morning together, if we had incidents where we've got wildfires and flooding, whether that's on the same day or literally the next day, part of this whole conversation has been about preparing people for prevention. But what do we do about people panicking, and what advice are you giving to people in the event of a big climate event, the advice that people should be doing?
So this is where the role of our control officers is absolutely critical. So a lot of the learning that came out of Grenfell and around fire survival guidance in particular has now been taken and developed further, that actually it's survival guidance across a whole broad spectrum of incidents that you may face. And this has been pushed by the National Fire Chiefs Council, that now has national operational guidance for fire control officers. So our fire control officers in London actually go through survival guidance across a whole range of incidents, not just fire survival guidance. So whether it's flooding or whether they're trapped in transportation, for example, there is that specific guidance that exists within the National Operational Guidance Framework, which actually for operational firefighters had existed for a long period of time, but actually since 2019 has now also existed for control officers to make sure that that guidance is being provided across a whole spectrum of incident types, whether it's fire, whether it's flooding, or whether it's a particular rescue incident, which is a significant step forward in terms of preparing our control officers to provide that advice, to keep people calm and to give people the right advice going forward. The point you raise around the challenges that can mean in terms of the sheer number of calls that we're able to deal with. There's something called Operation Willowbeck, which is our arrangements for overspill calls going to other fire and rescue services. We've also got something called National Talk Group 20, which means we can use an airwave channel to directly communicate with other control rooms. So it means there's that shared situational awareness that if London Fire Brigade is coming under particular pressure, our partner agencies, particularly Staffordshire and West Mids Fire Control, who we have a buddy relationship with, are made aware of that and can take our calls. And then we've got recall arrangements in place as well. So if control is coming under particular pressure, we can recall control officers who will live in the local area to come in, and we've done that on numerous occasions over the last year, to bolster our numbers in control to make sure we're able to take those calls. But we're in a much better position for control, because I think control probably was a bit of a Cinderella element of the National Fire Service nationally, not just an issue in London, but nationally, that wasn't given the due regard that it should do. And one of the reasons we've made a number of the changes that we have, particularly since 2019, is to make sure that the role of control in that our operational response actually begins the moment that 999 call is received in the control room. And it begins with the advice that's given to callers coming in all the way through to the resolution of that incident, and embedding our control officers now within our central operational support is the way that we make sure that that continues to happen. But we're in a better position now than we were even this time last year.
It's really good to see the improvements. In fact, one of my first ever mayor's question time, I asked the mayor about these leaflets to basement flats, so it's just good to see these things rolling out. Alex, if I can turn to you, and I'll give the Deputy Commissioner a break from my disaster scenarios before lunchtime. Sustainable urban drainage systems, SUDS. What role do they play in tackling surface water flooding, and what role will they play in torrential rain?
So we see SUDS as a critical sort of first line of defence. Our drainage and wastewater management plan, basically we see as a sort of a SUDS first plan, both in terms of the sheer volume of measures required, but also in our approach in assessing what we think is the right type of response to flood risk. So in the DWMP, it identifies for London of the order of 7,000 hectares of impermeable land drained to SUDS by 2050. This is going to be a game changer for London. We are currently working with partners to look at how do you effectively deliver that scale of green infrastructure, because the current processes of doing it would never get us to that scale in the time we need it to. So we're looking at innovative things like SUDS markets, etc. We see that the role they play is that they essentially slow down the rate of rain hitting our sewers. A great amount of the stress our sewers are under, as Jonathan outlined, is due to that loss of green space in the capital, causing more water to run off more quickly into our sewers, of which we've been increasing the capacity of, but not at the rate that they would need to in order to manage this loss of green space and the combined pressures of climate change. So we see it as a really important contribution to the provision of our infrastructure, and one that provides multiple benefits. So it also will therefore potentially come with multiple funding streams to help its delivery. And we are developing our business plan for the next 5 years, and we will be asking Ofwat for some significant funding to escalate our ability to work with partners to deliver SUDS in that first 5-year period, to then build the capacity to deliver the huge thousands of hectares required by 2050.
Thank you. You talked earlier about having this tablet that monitors water flow. I was wondering if there's something similar for data on sewage flows or drainage.
So what we've been doing is we've been putting sewer depth monitors into our network. These are small devices that measure the flow in the sewers, and our plan is to install, I think it's 30,000 of them over the next 5 years across our company area, so not just the London region. And what we do is we connect that into our what's called our ICM live network model. And what that will enable us to do is to understand what is the flow in our sewers as measured by the SDMs versus the flows that are projected by the model based upon an assumption of what rain is doing, etc. And our view is to be able to move towards having a smart system network where essentially we have enough telemetry in our systems to be able to run scenarios and do forecasts and nowcasts to tell us how our system will respond to forecast rainfall, so we're aware of its impact before we get the phone call from our customers telling us that there is an issue. It's a 5-year journey initially to get us to that sufficient distribution of sewer depth monitors, and is part of our long-term journey to improve the efficiency of our network and our services.
Thank you. And finally, this might be for you, Alex, but it might also be for Simon, so I'll let you work it out. At Pudding Mill Lane, we saw where SUDS didn't work. So actually, in fact, you could argue it almost caused a flood. Now, I'm not for a second arguing against SUDS. It's really clear that we need them. But what work is being done, particularly around the planning of SUDS, to make sure that they're effective and they're regularly monitored?
So I think there are two key challenges with SUDS. The first thing is trying to standardise the design so we can reduce the cost of them. Because at the moment, most SUDS projects, they seem to cost as much to design as they do to install, which is crazy. And if we're to achieve the kind of hectareage that we believe is necessary, we need to standardise that design and understand the performance it's going to provide. So we could say a rain garden of set dimensions will manage a certain amount of water from a certain return period rainfall event. So there is work going on to do that. We're looking at examples from New York, for example, have committed to install 10,000 rain gardens, and they've come up with a standardised design, and we're looking at can we borrow from that, for example. The second issue is the maintenance of SUDS. If you don't maintain them, they die off, and they don't perform the performance that we need them to, and there may be that an assumption has been made to invest in SUDS rather than grey infrastructure, and therefore there's a double whammy of not only you not getting the benefit, but you've not put in place something else. So that is something that we're hoping we're confident the London Surface Water Strategic Group is going to start to look at, and might also be further confirmed by the SUDS approval body decision as part of Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act that we're waiting to receive confirmation on from government.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Assemblymember Hall is going to come on to mitigation.
Hi. Some of these have sort of been asked by Assemblymember Cooper. So if I can ask Thames Water, whichever of you, is if there's anything else you want to add, because the question is, what are you doing to ensure that if there's a drought situation, London Fire Brigade is prioritised to access water as an emergency? And also, can you assure Londoners living in high-rise buildings that water access will be available promptly in the event of a fire, even in a drought period?
Sure, as you sort of recognise, and we've covered some of these sort of areas with my previous answers, but to say we're sharing data as best we can with the LFB, and we're committed to continue that, and as our sort of models and tools and quality and quantity of data improves, and we'll make sure that's reflected through the app, and that they will always have the best visibility of data that we have. In terms of water availability during a drought, let's say the event response, and particularly if it's a fire event or is a priority to our control room. They will provide boots on the ground. They'll provide sort of support from a sort of remote control room sort of scenario to make sure that we are able to operate our assets in the best way, whether that involves switching pumps, increasing pressures in areas, operating valves to move water around more efficiently. There's always a trade-off in there that you start over-pressurising areas. There's a risk of pipes failing, and then you end up with no water, which is obviously a decision that those folk have to make kind of in the moment. But that we will always prioritise that event support. It is called for on occasion by the fire brigade, and that's having received that call, we would then make the resources available for that. In terms of the broader question about availability of water during a drought, as I sort of said earlier, that there are sort of formal routes we can go down around sort of temporary use bans and things which are sort of longer term and are triggered by specific thresholds that are preset for us to say that we have responsibilities, but equally our customers and water users have responsibilities during those situations to make sure that non-essential use is minimised, therefore sort of ensuring we've got the capability. And then in the kind of in the longer term, there's a whole load of measures which we've set out in our recent draft water resource management plan, which is the kind of water equivalent to the drainage and wastewater management plan that Alex referred to earlier, which is our kind of long-term view of how we intend to maintain a sort of safe and resilient supply of water to London and the rest of our patch out to sort of 2100 and beyond. And there's a number of initiatives in there which talk about obviously the requirement to reduce leakage from our pipes, reduce leakage from our customers' pipes, make sure we understand and can help support sort of high usage and water sort of inefficiency. That talks about increasing the ability to store and transport water both into our regions, such as the Thames transfer scheme, to make better use of water that's already in our regions, such as the Teddington DRO option, and also to be able to capture more of the sort of the increasingly flashy rainfall events which we expect to happen with a changing climate, with the substantial new reservoir that we intend to build in Abingdon, which will give better storage. So there's a number of different measures which look into that sort of longer term to make sure that we secure a safe and reliable source of water for London and our wider region. And a lot of those initiatives will benefit other water companies which will supply the areas of London that we don't supply and other areas of the South East. It's very much a kind of sort of joint initiative between ourselves, the Environment Agency, our regulators, but also other water companies in the region.
Okay, thank you for that. Earlier you said that you would make use of possibly using water in lakes or rivers or whatever else. In the break you very kindly talked to me about Wealdstone Brook. And of course the water in Wealdstone Brook is so dirty, nothing will live in it. So would you have a list of waterways of any description that the water is so filthy that it can't sustain any life, that the fire brigade could not therefore use? Is there a list of any water channels that they couldn't use?
Yeah, sure. I'm not aware of any such list, but obviously we can take that away. But my colleagues from the fire brigade would have to comment on whether there would be situations where the quality of water would limit its use in a sort of emergency scenario, such as you describe here. But as we've discussed, I'll make sure we get you a substantive response on Wealdstone Brook, which I think that there's other more pressing issues around that which we need to respond to.
Yes, it just occurs to me that, would one use that? So if I can go over to you, Jonathan, would you use water that is so contaminated that it can't sustain life?
Well, it's so every operational incident that we attend, we effectively have a water strategy in place to make, because for obvious reasons when dealing with a fire scenario, making sure you've got a constant and steady supply of water is critical to the safe resolution of that incident. So what we would do is we'd use our tactical advisors, our bulk media advisors, to give us advice in terms of what water supply is best to actually deal with the incident that we've got. I don't know of an example yet where we've looked to an open water source and actually came to the conclusion that that wasn't fit for use in order to firefight, because obviously it comes down to priorities. If we're looking to bring a fire under control,
I understand.
Then we will obviously use water that obviously we wouldn't drink, but actually would be suitable in order to bring a fire under control. But it's where we use our bulk media advisors. It's where we use things like our high volume pumps, and of course our own pumping appliances have in the region of 1,600 litres of water on them. So we are in a good position to be able to deal with it, and it would be a judgment call as to what open source water we would use in any fire scenario.
Yep, no, I understand that, but equally, 'cause since we have these areas now, I wondered whether it's something that should be looked at, because it's obviously of interest.
No, I think you raise a very fair point, and this is where that local risk understanding at that very local level, that local commanders will understand what open water sources will work best for us if we weren't able to use the hydrant supply in the way that we would always go to as our first port of call. So I think it's a very fair point.
Okay, fine, thank you. And Simon's going to write to me about that, and I'm very grateful for that. So moving back to you, Jonathan, on the other things, and before I go on, I must say that the gardens on the fire stations are spectacular on some of them. And I remember looking in Soho quite a while ago, absolutely incredible. So well done to those firefighters that make it such an enjoyable place to be in. You're trialling the first electric hybrid fire appliance. Can you tell us how that's progressing and whether the appliance is delivering for what is needed?
Yeah, so that trial is going to be taking place at Hammersmith, but with the permission of the chair, if I can hand over to my colleague Mostaque Ahmed, whose teams are actually responsible for bringing that trial on. But yeah, that's been based at Hammersmith at the moment. It's something we're particularly excited to see, because this is front-end technology in terms of what this could mean for us as a fire and rescue organisation, and the capability that electric vehicles are going to bring, and for us to play our part in getting us down to net zero by 2030. But if with the permission of yourself, Assembly Member Hall, and the Chair, I'll hand over to my colleague Mostaque Ahmed.
Thank you for that question. Yes, we're really pleased to be kind of stimulating this market and being part of that kind of innovation for the sector as a whole. Where the what we call the Zero Emissions Pumping Alliance is due to be trialled. We have trained the trainers, so to speak, and we're provisionally expecting from the 24th of July to train kind of staff at Hammersmith and I think a couple of neighbouring fire stations, with the anticipation that then it will actually be on the run from autumn. We haven't got an exact date because partly depends on the scheduling, the training dates for staff over the summer period. But from this autumn, we expect to be actually tested. So the appliance has a range of over 200 miles and continuous pumping for 4 hours. So we do kind of want to test it properly in that sense. I'd be very happy to show you yourself and other committee members on a visit when it's up and running. I'm
sure we'd love to see it. So recharging these, I mean, how big are the batteries on these? They must be huge.
They are at the moment. So we've had to obviously provide facilities at Hammersmith fire station in terms of the charging as well around that. And that's one of the challenges for a wider rollout of this kind of technology, because it will mean that we will have to look at longer term other stations where we might need to scale up some of our electrical power supply. But this is a changing market, so we expect that over time, that once we've got this trial, that it will stimulate others in the market. And actually, as we've seen with other such kind of batteries, that actually there'll be innovations over time which will hopefully make it smaller. But we want to kind of start here and just test the ability to really operate in a live environment.
Does it minimalise the rest of the space? Because I mean, I've seen how you pack these vehicles up. Every square inch is used. Does it mean that there's less space for equipment that you carry, or the lack of the size of the engine, does that accommodate the size of the battery?
I don't believe it has had a big impact. I think, but I will have to probably come back with probably details on that.
And how much extra weight does it? Because I'm aware how heavy these vehicles are anyway.
Yes.
How much extra weight does it put on the vehicles? Because clearly this could be damaging roads, and also the bridges. London's bridges are in a state anyway. So how much extra weight does this put on a vehicle?
Okay, we'll have to kind of write back in terms of the details of the extra weight, but we don't believe it will it has a kind of road license. We don't believe it will damage the road infrastructure, but we can provide the technical details on that.
Because there are other technologies being developed at the moment, aren't there, that actually might be better long term?
Potentially, it's a changing market, but none has been kind of tested for this kind of a fire appliance. We're not kind of putting all our eggs on this bucket. We think this is an innovation that is worth kind of trialling, testing. Although we're doing it from the London Fire Brigade, actually we'll be sharing the findings with the UK fire sector as a whole in a collaboration. And if over time there are other technologies, then we'll be open to looking at alternatives. But at the moment, there isn't anything equivalent for us to be able to kind of use that kind of meets the ambition that we have for the net carbon zero targets.
And how much extra money are you putting into the budget or looking long term to actually do this sort of decarbonising the fleet?
Overall, so we, for the first time last November, published our climate budget, which sets out what we would need to do to achieve our targets for net carbon zero by 2030. And in that, we set out the actions we would need to take, which elements were funded and which would be extra funding that would be required. And overall, in our climate budget, we set out that if we were to use our existing kind of capital budget and the run rate over to early 2030s, we can fund about £100 million from our existing kind of rolling forward our current budgets, but there would be a gap of about £240 million across fleet and property to achieve net carbon zero by 2030. And we're clearly exploring ways that we would potentially access the extra funding to fill that gap, from a combination of potentially looking at whether we could reprioritize in a better use some of our existing capital budget, apply for government grants. We were recently successful on the government's public sector decarbonation scheme, where it's a very competitive scheme, but we managed to get some match funding for that, as well as working with the GLA colleagues to potentially apply for green finance schemes, where our capital investment programs would benefit from a more preferential interest rate. So we're looking at all of those options.
Okay, and does that cost include replacing some forecourts? Because I know when you had the larger vehicles, the really big vehicles, you've had to reinforce and spend fortunes on redoing the forecourts, if you like, in order to take the weights of those additional vehicles. I mean, hundreds of thousands of pounds. I've seen that over the years. So does that include some sort of infrastructure replacement?
Yeah, so we've factored in terms of the costs I'm talking about, kind of all the costs, both to kind of stations and the fleet, and adjustments that would be required. So that's kind of the scale of the plans we set out. As I said, we published that detail in the November climate budget for the first time.
Okay, staggering amounts. Are there any other challenges to make sure that you're decarbonised by 2030?
Yeah, so I would say the main probably challenge area is around the fleet, because whilst we are trialling, and it's great that we're at the forefront of trialling this new kind of pumping appliance, we are reliant on the market kind of moving to be able to kind of make that more wide scale available and at a more kind of efficient cost. We're hoping that actually we'd see movement in the market to enable that, because that could constrain our and others' ambitions by 2030. We also clearly have an eye towards our existing replacement cycle. So typically a fire appliance has a life of 10 to 12 years. So what we want to do is make sure that we, as much as possible, tie into those natural replacement cycles to ensure value for money, as well as achieving our green targets. And the final point I'll say in terms of property and stations is around coordinating the works we require, for example, installing air source heat pumps works with other works that are required around the property estates, and making sure that that is coordinated, minimising disruptions to stations. But we're very excited that we've got a multi-pronged strategy to try and achieve that to scale.
Well, the Fire Brigade has been well known to always been at the front of the green issues. I'm very concerned, though, if you go too early with the electric model, I seriously think that other things will come in that will take over. Hydrogen, I think they're testing those with very big vehicles. I'm just concerned if you go in to get in there quick, things will change. And possibly make it more affordable, slightly on the back of time. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair. Really pleased to hear about the progress you've been making on decarbonising more broadly appliances. And I think it's, as you can see from what we're experiencing on the front line from the climate crisis, it's so important to have that coherent approach. So specifically in terms of fire stations and all the sort of moving parts that make it up, could you give us an update on what progress you're making on decarbonising fire stations? I know that we've got Walthamstow, which is in Assemblymember Murmer's patch, is the first carbon zero fire station in London. So could you tell us more about what we can do to get the rest of the fire stations over the line?
Sure, I can think of. So yes, we're very pleased with Walthamstow being the start, but it is only the start because obviously we want to do more of that across our estate. So at the moment we've also got funding agreed, and we're proceeding with 5 more stations where we would hope to achieve what we've done in Walthamstow, including, for example, putting in air source heat pumps. Ensuring that we've got LED lighting and other associated measures, which will mean that actually we take kind of use of gas out of the stations, because the electricity we use through our supplier is renewable, 100% renewable energy. So that's our kind of objectives. So the 5 next ones, which are, as I said, are funding, and this is where we've been very successful in getting some match funding from the government grant to a competitive process to supplement our own kind of funding. So they are Bethnal Green, Chelsea, Edmonton, Hainault and Islington, are the kind of the next 5. And then from that, we've got a longer list of what would be the next tranche, where we'd be developing the business case and probably applying to the GLA for their green financing scheme to help fund that. As well. But it's also, as well as infrastructure, it's also about actually demand management as well. So we've installed a building management system throughout kind of the brigade that allows us to kind of monitor energy uses, and also a portal that any staff can access to, see whether the bay doors are open and other things. And that's actually, by some measures, usage has reduced by 15%, partly with the aid of that kind of better demand management tool. As well, we've got a wider program of replacing, this year we're looking to replace kind of 40 gas cookers with electric powered cooker ranges as well. A big next step for us is the point I made earlier about upgrading the electricity capacity at stations, because that, without that could be a constraint, both in terms of removing gas or indeed not having enough EV chargers facilities. So we've just developed a business case to roll out upgrades to electrical substations, initially probably 30 stations, and then a second tranche of 25, and that's going through the GLA kind of approval process.
Thank you. Good to hear about the sort of plan for the next 5 stations, and hopefully we'll get more match funding from government and also green financing from the GLA. How achievable is it to have all fire stations in London decarbonised by 2030 with this timeline, though?
It will be a challenge, but it's one that is achievable if we get. I think the main challenge is the funding. So going back to I mentioned the gap, but I think we are getting a lot of support from the GLA and colleagues, and we're having, we're just about to enter a new budget planning round. So we would be kind of making our case for that, as well as looking at our own existing capital investment program and how we leverage that to make sure we're at the same time, not only dealing with where we are, for example, doing works around windows placement, appliance bedrooms, actually making sure that they contribute to our kind of climate goals, as well as continue to kind of lobby government for grant funding. We were successful, but it's very competitive. There's limited funds, and we'd like more around that.
No, absolutely. And like I said, fingers crossed that the GLA Green Financing Scheme continues to support the aspiration to decarbonise all fire stations. And is it fair to say that ideally what we'd want is match funding per station from government?
Yes, whether it's per station or actually a proportion of our overall programme, and then we get to choose the stations. The important thing is that actually it's recognised that both locally and nationally it's a shared goal we're trying to achieve, and that therefore there's shared kind of funding to achieve that.
And you think the government gets that message?
I hope so. As I said, we're making use of whatever's currently available. Would obviously it'd be great if there was more available.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll echo your calls on that. Thank you very much.
And finally, we go to Assembly Member Bakari.
Yeah, I'm just going to wrap it up. Jonathan, we've heard about the fleet and we've talked about the stations and the challenges of reaching net zero by 2030. We've talked about the gap of £240 million. Is it really achievable that we can reach net zero by 2030 without that money? And what are you going to say to us to try and make sure that we get that money?
Well, as Mostaque's already alluded to, we're absolutely committed to getting to net zero by 2030. We're one of the anchor institutions within the GLA, and it's important that we play our part in enabling this to happen. There are real challenges. Our estate is very varied. We've got stations that date back to pre-war, which obviously lends itself to particular challenges. Mostaque was being very polite. There's also cultural challenges for us on a station in terms of the way that we think about the station, so things like turning lights off, shutting door. With the building management system that Mostaque was alluding to before can almost act a bit like a big brother, if I'm honest. So I can phone up the station commander and ask why Haynort's doors are open and have been open for the last hour or 2 hours. So it's this type of technology that's enabling us to use our estate in a much smarter way. I think there's a broader question around collaboration, particularly with the London Ambulance Service and the Metropolitan Police, in terms of how we can utilise our estate even more. So putting in the infrastructure that we're doing at the moment around electrification, well, actually the London Ambulance Service and the Metropolitan Police also face similar challenges. So actually, is there something we can do within our estate that actually it's not just looking at it from a purely London Fire Brigade perspective, it's across all of those agencies, and I think that's work that my teams and Mostaque teams are doing at the moment in terms of what we can do to share that responsibility across the blue light services in particular. There will be an element of offsetting that I think would need to come into it as well. There's particular challenges around the fleet. A fire appliance requires significant power in order to provide, the pumping capability in order to resolve some of the incidents we've been talking about earlier on in this committee. So there's particular challenges there. But, we've got over 114 electric cars now within the fleet that officers are using. We're committed to the infrastructure changes on our fire stations and across the estate more broadly. There is a question around funding and how we can access that funding to enable it to happen, but we're absolutely committed to the 2030 target, and we will look to see how we can manage that between now and 2030. And as well as the infrastructure challenges, there's a broader cultural question for us to make sure that we're managing ourselves and managing our estate and managing how we use that estate in the most carbon efficient way.
Have you set a target in terms of timing and of when you're going to start panicking that you're not going to achieve that target of 2030? Because £240 million, that's an amazing amount of money to try and fund and find the funding for. I expect that the net zero carbon strategy that you've got isn't fully funded right now. So what are you going to do if you don't achieve that amount of money that you need? At what point will you start saying, I don't think we're going to do this? Or have you got some sort of timeline of where you're going to really find yourself at a point where you're going to have to say, I don't think this is going to happen, or how are you going to push the government?
Well, it's something that we monitor constantly. So, I mean, Mostaque will come in here in terms of his teams within the property department, but it's something that we're constantly monitoring to understand, well, actually, what level of building works can we bring in, and what does it look like? How do we balance up the needs around electrification against solar panel installation, around things like heat pumps that are going in, and match that against the privacy for all work that's also going around fire stations at the moment. And it has to come together, that actually when we do these building works, we do it in completeness rather than actually doing it in separate elements. And that all sits within the new estate strategy, which I'm sure Mostaque can come on to in a moment, which has now just been written to make sure that we are planning this in and where we're getting pinch points. And if we think some of those targets that we are committed to meeting are becoming too much of a stretch, then we need to escalate that as quickly as we possibly can. But it is a challenge, but we are absolutely committed to hit that net zero target by 2030.
I'm loving the fact that you want to do this. You want to make this achievable. You want to make this a realistic target. But I also think we need some honesty as well. You need to say, we need more money. At what point? When is that going to happen? When are you going to say?
Well, Mostaque will correct me if I'm wrong, but the current trajectory in terms of how we're looking to manage our fleet, how we're looking to manage our estate, we are as confident as you can be that we will meet that target. But is there going to be a question around financing in terms of how we make that? There absolutely will be, but that is constantly being monitored. And when we need to flag it, if we think we're not going to hit that target, then we will do. But of course, all of that will be balanced up against any offsetting that we can also do. And I think that's an area that we will have to consider if we get to a position where just the money is not available, we don't think we're going to hit those targets for whatever reason that may be, and we flag that at the earliest opportunity. But Mostaque might add some more on that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add that we will be updating our carbon budget every year. So when we publish our budget submission in November again this year, we will update the one we did last year, and actually that will show how far we have progressed and what the trajectory is, and obviously so it'll be very transparent about actually are we progressing along the trajectory that we set last year. If we're not, are we off course, and actually what more might we need in terms of funding or other overcoming other challenges. So we'll be very transparent in publishing that every year.
I appreciate the transparency that you always bring along to the committee. Thank you.
Okay. Can I just say thank you to all of you for today. I think we've had an interesting discussion, and thank you for all of your contributions. We have a few short items of business before we conclude. You're welcome to stay for those, or you're welcome to leave. It just takes a minute. Can we note the report and today's discussion? And can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from this discussion? And can the committee note its work programme for the 2023-2024 year? And the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 28th of September 2023 at 10 a.m. in the chamber at City Hall. I have no other urgent business. I now declare the meeting to be closed. Thank you.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.